everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. I assume we'll give it about a minute or two just to see if others roll in from the waiting room. In the meantime, we'll start with the land acknowledgement. So while we're waiting to officially begin, if you know whose Indigenous lands you are tuning in from, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We're always curious to see where folks are coming from. And yeah, we'll get started in just about a minute or so. All right, so I think we'll get started, and then I know Kaylee's monitoring the waiting room, so as folks come in, they can just join us. Good day, Louise, Nocha, Benawapskeg, Wabanaki, Kachiwiliwini, Kachiniwez, Nagunsis. Good afternoon or evening. My name is Sage Phillips. I'm a member of the Penobscot Nation, coming from the Wabanaki people with homelands in what we currently refer to as the state of Maine. I'm a senior here at UConn as a student coordinator with the Native American cultural programs and also a member of Land Grab CT and the president of NASA. So I will begin with our land acknowledgement. This applies to those of us tuning in from UConn store specifically. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the territory of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scotticut, Golden Hill Pagusset, Nipmuc, and Lenape peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. So before we get started, I'm just going to read a little bit about who is here with us today, and then I'll pass it off. So first we have Tristan Ahtone, a member of the Kiowa tribe and is an incoming editor-at-large at GRIST. He previously served as editor-in-chief at the Texas Observer and Indigenous Affairs editor at High Country News. He has reported for Al Jazeera America, PBS NewsHour, National Native News, NPR, and National Geographic. Ahtone's stories have won multiple honors, including investigative awards from the Gannett Foundation and Public Radio News Directors Incorporated. He additionally led the High Country News team that received a George Polk Award, an IRE Award, a Sigma Award, a Society of News Design Award, and a National Magazine Award nomination. A past president of the Native American Journalists Association, Ahtone is a 2017 Neiman Fellow and a director of the Muckrock Foundation. Dr. Robert Lee is a historian of the United States focused on Indigenous dispossession and U.S. state formation in the 19th century American West. Dr. Lee's research focuses on North American colonization, mostly in the 19th century. He is currently writing a history of U.S. expansion by Indian treaty using an approach that combines archival digging with spatial analysis in GIS. The project that informs the keynote this evening is titled Land Grab Universities, which details how Indigenous land funded land-grant colleges across the United States. Land Grab U is also the inspiration for landgrabct.org. The Land Grab CT project is produced by UConn's Greenhouse Studios in conjunction with the Native American Cultural Programs and Native American and Indigenous Students Association, as well as the DOT Impact Initiative at the Human Rights Institute. The Land Grab CT project launched this past Monday, Indigenous Peoples Day, and was inspired by the Land Grab U project, which extensively collected and mapped land data tied to land-grant universities at the 1862 Morrill Act. Land Grab CT is a localization of the data from this project, as well as an expansion of understanding land-grant institutions in a larger colonial context. Please feel free, after the events from tonight conclude, to take a closer look at UConn's colonial history at landgrabct.org. So without further ado, I bring to you Tristan Ahtone and Dr. Robert Lee, the authors of Land Grab You.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to talk about the story. Also, congratulations on all the work that y'all have been doing. It's really, it's just phenomenal to see the everything that y'all are up to there, and all the organizing and everything that's been going on around this. So it's really a pleasure to be here. So my partner, Dr. Lee, and I will give you an overview of the story, as well as some of the practical uses of the platforms that we've built. And a reminder, obviously, if you like, we're using the hashtag LandGrabU to help aggregate stories. I think y'all are as well. So feel free to use it if the mood strikes you. So in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Morrill Act, which distributed public domain lands to raise funds for fledgling colleges across the nation. And the story that we've learned around the Morrill Act is that land-grant universities were given the gift of free land to bring education to the masses. But as our investigation in High Country News reveals, the Morrill Act worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into seed money for higher education. And in all, the act redistributed nearly 10.8 million acres of land from more than 250 tribal nations for the benefit of 52 colleges. But the Morrill Act's footprint is broken up into almost 80,000 parcels of land scattered across 24 states, making research and reporting on its impacts nearly impossible. But through our 2-year investigation, we've been able to identify and map those 80,000 individual land parcels to better understand the relationship between higher education and violent colonialism. And just to give you sort of a picture, combine those scattered parcels represent an area approximately the size of Denmark. So the project really offers an opportunity for additional reporting, research like y'all are doing, as well as collaboration to further the investigative work. And we'll discuss that in more detail in a moment, but I'll start by turning it over to Bobby to talk more about the Morrill Act and how this project came to be.
Thanks, Tristan, and thank you to Sage and the entire Land Grant CT team that has put this event together. We met with the group a few months ago, and we've been very much looking forward to this event and seeing how this project is developing here. I was looking at the website earlier today. It's really an amazing piece of work, and I hope it leads to more action in Connecticut about the issue of Indigenous land at land-grant universities. So what I'd like to do today is give you some background on the project and provide additional detail on the Morrill Act of 1862 and our approach to investigating it and unpacking it. So the indigenous sources of university land has been an emerging issue in the last few years. And it came, as many of you can probably imagine, out of studies of slavery and the university that provided a sort of natural springboard to think about the land at land-grant universities. So we saw like little hints and sort of fits and starts of in scholarship of different scholars, historians, theorists, trying to think about and think through this issue. So you see in Roxanne Dunbar Keyes's book, An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, this issue is flagged in just a sentence. There's cultural theorists like Kay Wayne Yang who are discussing it from the perspective of decolonizing the university. You saw some targeted work by scholars of education like Sharon Stein and Margaret Nash, who started framing the Morrill Act of 1862 as settler colonial legislation that took from indigenous nations to expand agricultural and mechanical education for settlers, and started to do the work of unpacking how this system functioned. At the same time, there were some groups that got interested in mapping these parcels. There was some student research at places like UMass and Virginia Tech where they were trying to map the Morrill Act parcels associated with those universities and to connect them to indigenous nations. But those projects hit some snags. There were also some schools like the University of Iowa, Michigan State, University of Nebraska that started to map the Morrill Act parcels, but they weren't asking who the land's original owners and caretakers were. And what these early efforts sort of made clear were three things. First of all, that we now had the theoretical tools to rethink the foundations of land-grant universities, and we're really primed to use them. I have not spoken to anyone in working on this project or in, subsequent to publishing it, who didn't immediately understand the issue at stake here. It's sort of like throwing on a light switch that, of course, the land and land-grant universities had to come from somewhere, and it's not particularly surprising that it came from indigenous dispossession, which was the fundamental act at the heart of North American colonization. Second, what we saw from these early efforts was that we now had the methodological tools to look into this issue more deeply, to develop a concrete body of actionable empirical knowledge. And these tools were sort of emerging techniques in digital spatial analysis, things like GIS and digital cartography. And also what became apparent was that it was the right time to do this. And by and large, the question of how land-grant universities were built with indigenous land had been overlooked. It had been neglected in the scholarship and public memory of land-grant universities. So that is where the High Country News collaboration came in, and we got started in 2018. Tristan and I were both fellowships at the same university. He's a journalist, I'm a historian, so it was sort of fortuitous that we were able to meet and develop this really a disciplinary hybrid project that combines historical research with spatial analysis and investigative journalism, and tries to bundle them together into a multimedia report designed to communicate our findings, to support ongoing research, and to draw attention to the living legacy of colonialism and genocide that's baked into the foundations of land-grant universities, and to make possible the type of work that we see now emerging in Connecticut. So let me tell you a little bit about the Morrill Act itself. It was not the first law to redirect indigenous land into endowments for colleges or universities. This was happening earlier in the antebellum period with state universities. One of the earliest federal grants is in 1803 to a college in Mississippi. This is happening in the colonial era. What happens in 1862 is the nationalization of this form of funding higher education with expropriated indigenous land, the idea that a national system of land-grant colleges was going to be created. And the idea behind it was this, mid-19th century notion of social uplift for the white majority, of expanding education for the agricultural classes, the industrial classes, of providing a practically minded education in the agricultural sciences and mechanical arts. And the literature that has emerged to think about what land-grant universities were, what they do, has talked about them in terms of sort of democracy's colleges. This is what you'll see if you take a look at the literature on land-grant universities. And the question is, has always been, to what extent did land-grant universities realize this ideal of expanding or democratizing higher education in the United States? The question of where did the funding come from was not sort of on the table. Now, the law itself, in 1862, it comes in the Civil War. It's at a time when you have three landmark land laws passed. In 1862, you have the Homestead Act, you have the Pacific Railroad Act, and just a couple of days later, you have the Morrill Act. Now, these are three really of thousands that are passed in the 19th century. Thousands of land laws are passed that redistribute the public domain. But in 1862, you have this sort of watershed of redistribution happening. If we go to the next slide, I can tell you a little bit about how the Morrill Act worked as a functioning law. You know, what does it do? How does it actually redistribute this land? So this image here, this is by Margaret Pierce, the cartographer on the project. She's also made the static maps for the article, some of which you'll see later on. But this is sort of you don't need to read the details here. You don't need to squint. It's just sort of like the breakdown, step-by-step guide of how the Morrill Act works. The first thing that has to happen after the law is passed is that, you know, Congress offers participation to all the states, and states have to sign on, and they have to agree to provide some administrative support for taking one of these land grants. Now, where does the land come from? Some of it has already been acquired from indigenous nations through various treaties, ratified, unratified treaties, and some is going to be acquired in the future. It hasn't been obtained yet. Third is that these grants are not uniform. They vary wildly in size. Connecticut's grant, I believe, is 180,000 acres. They range anywhere from 90,000 to 990,000, almost 1 million acres. And it's basically how much land a state gets depends on the size of the congressional delegation of the state, which is a proxy for population. So the most populous state in 1860, New York, gets the largest grant, nearly 1 million acres. Now, the parcels that these are broken up to are going to, you know, sort of vary in size. Some of them will be less than an acre. They'll be up to 640 or maybe 800 acres, but mostly around 160, the sort of typical size of homestead that you would get through the Homestead Act. The fourth point here that I'll go into a little bit more in a minute is the two main ways in which the land is selected for the endowments for the universities. There's an east-west breakdown, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. And the fifth thing that has to happen is the land has to be disposed of. It has to be sold. Now, what you have in the land that the states receive, some eastern states receive something called scrip, which are like these coupons to select land anywhere in the public domain, and western states have to select land within their state boundaries. Connecticut, for instance, is a scrip state. It is going to get these coupons to select land on the public domain of the United States, land that's been acquired through coercive means from hundreds of indigenous nations. And in the case of Connecticut, what you're going to see, and what you see in lots of these scrip states, is that they sell off the scrip in bulk to speculators who sort of snap it up. And that's what happens in Connecticut's case. They sell it off in one fell swoop in 1863, and then this is redeemed by people who buy it or who can resell it on secondary markets. But if we go to the next slide, I just want to highlight for you the big difference in how the land is selected, this east versus west. So here you see on the left is the University of California. This is California is a state that's on the public domain. It hasn't redistributed most of the land that's been acquired there through the genocide in California in the 1850s. And so states like California have to select land from within their boundaries, whereas here's Cornell on the right here, one of these scrip states. Their parcels wind up being redeemed through this scrip anywhere on the public domain. You know, it can be 14, 15, 16 different states. And what you see here on this slide in the red is the statistics that can be generated by approaching this problem sort of at scale and trying to do it, trying to address the entirety of these state grants. You can understand exactly how much land there was, exactly how many indigenous nations had their land expropriated that fed into these grants, how much money was raised per parcel and in aggregate by all of them. And you can also go in from this sort of bird's eye view. If we go to the next slide, you can see, you know, one of these parcels. This is Tucson, Arizona. This highlighted in red here is a square mile parcel, 640 acres in downtown or somewhere within the city of Tucson. You can see in the middle here a satellite view of that parcel. You can see how accurate you can map these. I mean, these are parcels that you can put into a GPS and you can drive to. In this case, you can see a baseball diamond, a football field. That's probably a high school we're looking at there. You see the highway cutting through tract housing. And if you get all the way to the ground level, you can see is Kalen Goodluck, the photographer for the project. This is a photo that he took, the Apache Tears Motel on this Apache Western Band land that was taken by the United States in 1866. 1886, excuse me. Nothing was paid for it. It raised $2,000 for $2,004 for the University of Arizona's land grant endowment. Kalen went on a sort of mini tour of the West trying to find these parcels using the tools that we were able to build to locate them through GPS. If we go to the next slide, we can get a sense of what the High Country News collaboration was all about. This is it in its most condensed form, finding all of the pieces, all of these parcels, putting them into a composite whole that describes the geographic footprint of the Morrill Act and its connections to hundreds of indigenous nations. The project's goal really was to unspool the Morrill Act not completely, to not just identify the parcels that benefited a single university or were located in a single state, but to locate them all insofar as that's possible. And to track down the indigenous origins of every single parcel in order to gain a sense of the enormity of the wealth transfer that the Morrill Act entailed. And that's really the key point here. The Morrill Act was not a donation from the federal government to endow these universities. It was a wealth transfer through the federal government from indigenous nations to land grant universities. And this map really represents that footprint in its most condensed form. What you're seeing here are some of the statistics that Tristan was alluding to earlier. This involves 10.8 million acres redistributed to 47 states that are going to funnel these lands or the funds raised from them into endowments for 52 universities. Most of these are public, like the University of Connecticut. Some are private. In Connecticut's case, you had both because the grant originally went to Yale, and then in the 1890s, it's transferred to State University in Connecticut. This involved nearly 250 tribes and nations whose land was claimed through 162 treaties. Some of these are ratified, some of them are unratified. They come through executive orders that are outright land takings. And when you look at how much was paid, it amounts to roughly $400,000 to acquire indigenous title, Indian title in the parlance of the 19th century to these parcels. And out of that, nearly $23 million is raised for the coffers of land grant universities. That's a ratio of 57-1. For every $1 that is paid to acquire Indian title, $57 is raised in land grant university endowment principal. In contemporary dollars, we're talking about an endowment principal worth about $500 million in today's dollars and 2020 dollars. And that's these nearly 80,000 parcels that you see here spread across 24 states. In Connecticut's case, we were able to locate 178,000, a little bit more than 178,000 acres out of their 180,000 acre grant, so 99% of it. We were able to figure out that there were 33 indigenous land cessions that these were connected to, that they involved 53 nations as parties to the different treaties and takings. The scrip was redeemed. Connecticut's scrip was redeemed in 12 states, mostly in Ojibwa and Ottawa territory. The Connecticut grant was actually one of the less profitable grants They sold the script in this one fell swoop in 1863. But what did less profitable mean in the context of the Morrill Act of 1862? The principal for the endowment was still over 10 times what was paid for Indian title for the same land. So that's what it means to be less profitable in this context. It is still a major windfall for these universities. And what you can do with this data set is you can reconnect histories of dispossession to histories of land redistribution, to move from an abstract understanding of universities as beneficiaries of conquest in some sort of vague and hazy way, to the ability to be able to tie specific institutions to specific tribal nations. Now let me hand it back to Tristan, and he'll tell you more about the project's online tools.
So one of the things that we really wanted to do with this project was make our data available to anybody who wanted to do any additional reporting or research, or even to fact check our findings. So if you're not comfortable with using Excel spreadsheets, if you're not a heavy data user, we really wanted to make sure that you could still have access to this information in a clear and user-friendly way. And on landgrabu.org, you have access to all of that same data that we were using with the same level of accuracy and precision, but you can also explore it through interactive maps, web pages, and really allows you to go beyond the story that we wrote to construct your own narrative around what the data provides. So university pages like Cornell's here, and we pick on Cornell a lot because they were the largest recipient and provide some of the most stunning visuals. But Cornell here gives you a lot of information, founding date, student enrollment, how many acres it received. But again, most importantly, you get to play with a map that we put together. So Jeff McGee and Cody Leff developed this site and these maps. And what it allows you to do is really see the connections between the institution and the land. So you can zoom in, you can get really detailed with it all the way down to the acre. You can fly through or even locate yourself on the map. On the side there, you'll see those crosshairs that allows the website to locate you and find out if you live next to or on one of these parcels. As our developer, Jeff McGee, found out during the reporting process. You can also have the opportunity to check addresses. So that search function at the bottom right of the screen allows you to check an address and see if it's on a parcel or even what land cession it's in. There's really just a ton of information here to play with. And it allows you to explore and, again, construct sort of your own narratives. You also have the options to play with links there on the side to click on state boundaries, university links, or even Indigenous land cessions. And obviously, the information around land cessions is really invaluable for a number of applications, even outside of this project. So nearly everything here is clickable, and you can just spend as much time as you like exploring the data. So here's an example here. If we look at, for instance, zoom out, you can see all the connections the University of Connecticut has to Morrill Act lands. Here from this view, you can kind of see the footprint, so to speak. But when you zoom into, as you see, there's a few parcels in Montana, you can see those actual parcels and the boundaries that we've extracted from those primary documents. And essentially what Cody and Jeff have done are create pages for each of these land parcels, all 80,000, so that you can get an incredible amount of information, acre by acre and state by state, and university by university. So when you click on this particular parcel in Montana, you'll get even more information. So you click through and you can see here that this parcel is 80 acres. It was acquired by the US from the Blackfoot and Chippewa in 1855 for $81 when adjusted for inflation. You can also see that Connecticut sold it for about $1,800. And again, just with this page, you can really start to construct a story about the very specific piece of land. But one of the big questions that we really wanted to tackle in this project is not just sort of providing strings of numbers and data and sort of satellite maps to sort of see the connections, but we really wanted to ask the question of what's there on this land, that land now. This particular parcel, we have no clue. We haven't been there, but it does offer some opportunities to be able to do some exploration through Google Street View, or even traveling to these particular parcels, because the site works on mobile so that you can actually go there and locate yourself on your phone and travel to those actual parcels and see their boundaries, which is what our photographer Kaylin Goodluck was doing, and is how we figured out that, for instance, the Directors Guild of America is built on a Morrill Act parcel in Los Angeles. It's how we know that the Fort Lawton Post Cemetery in Seattle, Washington was once Duwamish and Suquamish land. And again, once you start looking at those small stories that are associated with that land, you can see, for instance, with this particular parcel, it was ceded by treaty in 1855 for the benefit of Clemson University and South Carolina State. And also being able to build on that, despite negotiating this treaty with the federal government, the Duwamish are still unrecognized and continue to advocate for their rights, which are guaranteed under federal law. This land was sold for about $4, and those universities raised about $58 from its sale. This being able to travel there is how we found these cornfields, which was acquired from the Kansas tribe for $24.32, sold by Ohio State for $1,784.31. And then one of my favorite photos that Kaylin took was this land in El Rosa, Minnesota, which was taken from the Dakota and sold by the University of Minnesota for nearly $1,000. And as you can see, it's now a scrapyard. So these are just a few of Kaylin's pictures, but really illuminates the personality, I guess you could say, of the sort of haunting and beautiful places that you can discover just using the app. And should you want to, going to these very sites to spend some time with the land and see what's there and really think about this history and what that inspires in you when you sort of know that history stretching back to acquisition by the US and what even happened before. One last thing is that there's still a lot of work to be done around this project. Almost by fluke, we discovered that a number of universities still had Morrill Act acres in their possession, as well as mineral acres. So at least 16 land-grant universities, which are nearly a third of the schools in the system, still retain more than 500,000 acres that brought in at least $8.7 million in revenue in fiscal year 2019 alone. Utah State, for example, that school collected more than $1 million in fiscal year 2019 from a remaining 28,000 surface acres and 52,000 mineral acres that were obtained through the Morrill Act. And when I say it was a fluke that this came about, we knew that from the literature that some schools still had surface acres that were associated with the Morrill Act. It was only when we were reaching out to confirm this with institutions that Ohio essentially let us know that, yes, they still had the surface acres, and also we had the mineral acres, which we had no clue was even on the table in terms of our reporting. So that sort of just popped up and gave us an entirely new avenue to dive into. And also keep in mind that we were only able to collect data on fiscal year 2019 while we were reporting. So the cumulative revenue from acquisition of this land to present at these institutions is completely unknown. And in some cases, for instance, Arizona and Wyoming had no clue how much money they had made even in 2019 off of that land, let alone the rest of the years, because they didn't disaggregate that land from the rest of their data. So this is saying it's at least 8.7 million, knowing that Wyoming thrives off of extractive industries. It's likely much higher. So those are stories that are really open to report and localized for folks that are interested in doing that kind of work. And of course, that data and all of this story's data is available for you to use and download from GitHub, and Dr. Lee will explain just how to do that.
Yeah, for those of you who do like Excel, we have something for you too. So the project, the sort of components for the project were curated at 3 levels. We have the magazine article where we guide readers through what the Morrill Act is, how it worked, and pull out some of the key findings from our own analysis of the data, putting these stories of Indigenous dispossession into the next to stories of growth of the universities that their land enabled. And that's a sort of guided approach. And then there is the landgrabu.org site that Tristan just went through, which is sort of a choose your own adventure approach. There is so much data here. There is no way to put it all into a single article or even into a single even into a book. It would just be massive to address all the histories of all of these parcels. So on the landgrabu.org site, you can explore as you like and find places that are meaningful to you through your life, or connected to your school, or to your or to a tribal nation, if you are a member. But there is a third level here, and that is it was important for us to make all of the data that we collected open access and publicly available, so further researchers wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel, so that students or other researchers, schools, could take this material and dig deeper without having to do the years of legwork that went into the construction of this database. So we put this all together and made it available on GitHub. This is the page that you can link through landgrabu.org. If we go to the next slide, there is, to not be afraid, there is a guide, a user's guide that spells out in plain English what each of the fields are, and each of the spreadsheets and the spatial data sets, the polygons of all the parcels that we have, and of all the Indigenous land sessions that we match them to. And it explains how to use all of this, all the components of this database together, and what you can extract out of it. And if you go to the next slide, we have the data itself. Yeah, this is what it looks like on my desktop. It's just a big spreadsheet. I mean, there is for most of it, you can just use it in something like Excel. If you want to map it, you need to use a program like ArcGIS or QGIS. But there is even more data here than what appears on the landgrabu site. For instance, something that you can do here is to figure out who were the patentees that actually redeemed the script that Connecticut sold. What were their names? Who acquired the most? Were there people who were sort of snatching up lots of it and using that in speculating with it in ways? You can dig in here to those types of questions. So that's the online data. Let me give it back to Tristan, and he'll tell you about what's been happening over the last sort of couple of years, almost 2 years since we published this material.
Yeah, so the project has really started what we see as a public conversation on the debts that universities owe to Indigenous communities. That is continued after publication, and we think will continue long into the future, thanks to actions like folks like you. And one of the big areas that we've been looking at, for instance, has been coverage around the reporting and the use of data. There have been really three areas, at least, that we've seen reporters play in when it comes to taking on the story, which is essentially localizing it, contextualizing it, and adapting it. So, for instance, what you're seeing in front of you here is the investigative news outlet Ion Ohio. And what they did was they mapped all of the lands that supported Ohio schools using the publicly available data. It's really kind of a great example of how reporters in one state could provide detailed, localized analysis of the information, being able to pull it down and putting it into even a very simple Google map. Then there was Vox magazine, which is produced by journalism students at the University of Missouri. And Vox looked specifically at Mizzou's footprint and relationship with the Osage, which is the indigenous community that school received land from. So using just a simple timeline, which is a bit difficult to see here on the screen, but it's a simple scrolling timeline in which reporters just added context to the data. So revealing that through essentially either miscommunication or deceptive practices, the Osage ceded all of their land to the federal government and were forced to move to Oklahoma, making that land available to the University of Missouri. And finally, we've seen a few stories that go beyond the data we collected and really utilize Dr. Lee's methodology here. And that, for instance, in September of last year, Scalawag magazine revealed that Southern universities funded their early years through the sale of land expropriated from indigenous communities. So basically building on the idea that Dr. Lee has come up with here in terms of putting all of these data points together and going even further back than the Morrill Act. So they focused on University of North Carolina, of which you can see on this map, and revealed essentially that the university took more than 200,000 acres of Cherokee and Chickasaw lands that were gained through indigenous removal. And they also were able to find that more than 30% of UNC's annual budget was comprised of land sales between 1818 and 1840, which is well before the Morrill Act became law. So these are some of the areas in terms of journalism that we've seen, and I'll let Bobby talk a little bit about some of the institutional actions we've seen.
Yeah, one of the most exciting things to see since this reporting came out is how institutions, how land-grant universities, their faculty, their students have been reacting to this project. I mean, what you see here is a petition from the Student Senate at the University of Florida. Came out a couple of months after we published, demanding the assembly of a working group to examine the University of Florida's connections to indigenous expropriation and slavery as well, in order to better understand and document the university's history. We've also seen the rewriting of land acknowledgements. If we go to the next slide, Washington State University was the first to rewrite its land acknowledgement in response to our data set, then pledged to commission a team to determine reconciliation plans. We've seen similar movement at Texas A&M, which is working toward assembling a task force to better understand the history of the Morrill Act on the institution, as well as its impacts on indigenous communities. We've also seen conference building. So if we go to the next slide here, conferences and teach-ins at UC Berkeley, for example, students, staff, and faculty held a 2-day symposium to explore and address the university's responsibility to indigenous communities in California. The meeting included nearly 24 speakers. There were breakout sessions to deal with calls to action, discussions of inspirations for accountability and analysis, particularly around land returns and the mechanics through which that might take place. And we've also seen what we're seeing here at Connecticut, taking place at other universities as well. At Cornell, which is the largest Morrill Act beneficiary, staff, faculty, and students launched a project to document the university's financial windfall through a regularly updated and dedicated website. You see it here. And the goal here is to present as much factual information about Cornell's parcels and to determine and consult with tribes impacted by Cornell in order to think through and determine possible remedies. At Ohio as well. I mean, just last week we were at this event. They launched their Stepping Up and Stepping Out and Stepping Up initiative on truth and reconciliation at Ohio State. A really robust program with the goal of creating a reconciliation and restitution plan for the institution and bringing impacted tribes to the table to discuss. They're working with the First Nations Development Institute there to think about next steps at Ohio State. Well, we don't have it here, but I would encourage everyone to look at the Land Grab CT site, which just launched a couple of weeks ago. There is some really amazing material on there. Timelines looking deep into Connecticut's history. Some of the photos of some of the parcels that we missed taking images of to try and kickstart discussions around this issue at Connecticut, which is really just amazing to see. So Connecticut isn't alone in doing this. It seems there's a sort of groundswell, and it's coming up from students, from staff, administrations, generally less interested, but hopefully we can move it in that direction. So this is just sort of a handful of things that have been happening. It really isn't one size fits all way to address this. But what we have been seeing is sort of small groups, like the one that is formed at Connecticut, getting together, interested in seeing this history recognized, seeing it acknowledged, and seeing action by their institutions. So that's sort of the overview of the Land Grab University's project, and we would be excited to take any questions that you have.
Well, thank you so much. We'll do a virtual round of applause. We're so appreciative of your work, and as we mentioned before, it really is the only reason why Land Grab Connecticut can even exist. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We will be taking questions, so if you would like to put it in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. And yeah, let's go from there. Christopher, go ahead.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much indeed. This is fascinating, and I can see so many things that are going to be able to be done with this. But I'm interested in what you think are the sort of different ethical responsibilities of campuses whose relationships to this land differs one from another. And I'm thinking the story about Connecticut that you've told, and I have to go and look at the Land Grab CT site and get this straight in my own mind, that the state of Connecticut sold the script more than 20 years before the university came into existence. And so, although we can identify, you have identified the parcels that script eventually raised or acquired, what is the evidence that the university, in this case, got any benefit from that? Or did the money go to the speculators who had bought the script from the state?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it has to do with the administration of these grants. So the Connecticut situation is somewhat unique because the endowment was moved. It was originally assigned to Yale University. Yes. So the script goes to the state. The state sells off the script for $135,000, I believe, and that goes to the benefit of Yale University. Now, how these endowments work is that the principal has to be held in perpetuity, and the universities can benefit from the interest that's earned off of it. So then the connection to Connecticut comes in the 1890s. Right. When Connecticut is creating a state university, they want to relocate the endowment. And that is where the benefit is going to come. Yale did not want to let it go. It tells you about the value of this. They took the state to court, and there was a mediation process through which the state had to pay them damages. Basically, they got a cash payout for the lost value of the endowment that was then switched to the University of Connecticut. So the University of Connecticut, which comes into existence later, is not a participant in the active sale of this land, but they are a beneficiary in perpetuity of the endowment that is raised from this land.
Okay, thank you. So that actually evens out the story in some ways. In other words, it's not that important that some got scrip and some got land, because the perpetual character of the endowment means that there is a connection that can be traced.
Yeah, they all get the funds, and that's what they're after. They're all looking, for the most part. I mean, there are some that hold on to portions of this land, as Tristan was talking about later, up until today. But most are eager to sell off the land to raise these endowments so they can start earning interest off the capital that's raised.
Okay, thank you very much. That's.
And just to add to that, the money, again, just to be very clear with everybody, that money is still sitting in y'all's accounts. So this is something that we've seen, for instance, at Texas A&M or MIT, is folks trying to track down where that money is actually sitting so that they can do some forensic auditing around those actual accounts. So, again, in the grand scheme of what UConn's endowment looks like today, it's pretty tiny. But remember, that was the seed money, and remember that it is still in a bank account someplace, still producing interest. So it's still on the books.
For anyone else that has a question, feel free to unmute.
I put mine in the chat. Hi, Bobby. I don't know if you remember we met. I've been wondering how the mammoths are doing, but this is
I can't see any video.
Oh, well, anyhow, I'm Nancy Shoemaker. I was just.
Oh yes, Nancy. Hi.
Yeah, it is phenomenal work, and just so eye-opening, and fantastic that you've done this and it's gotten the attention it has. The one thing I'm sure you've thought of and you probably have a response to is if people only think that it's the Morrill Land Grant that benefited universities, it sort of evades the issue of the lands that the universities sit upon and how they acquired those lands. So for instance, the Storrs campus, how did that, who were the indigenous owners of the Storrs campus? And how did that land get lost to them? So I'm wondering, if that issue has come up and how you work around that, because actually when you have your big map of the United States and the actual Morrill land grants, what you notice is really the white space, how much of that land is not Morrill land grant. And yet you could say, obviously all the land is indigenous land. So how do you kind of deal with that issue, if you understand what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, I do. No, this is a critical issue, and it's one that we address in the article, and it's really a springboard for the project. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the practice of land acknowledgements that have emerged and become popular, not just in the United States and Canada and New Zealand, and settler societies around the world. Now, these are very common at universities, and you'll have land acknowledgements will acknowledge precisely this, whose land the universities themselves stand upon. And part of the goal with this project was to to marry that element of land acknowledgements to a thing that had been left out of land acknowledgements was that universities are not just built on Indigenous land, they are built with Indigenous land, that's often distant and much harder to see the connection because it's sometimes, hundreds or thousands of miles away. And it is cycled through capital raising campaigns that enable the funding of the university. So it's the buildings themselves. It's where is the the lighting being paid for. It is the entire institution, and it's not just. This isn't where I thought you were. This is where I thought you were initially going with the question. It's not just institutions connected to the Morrill Act of 1862. This process is much wider than that in terms of institution building of public and quasi, public-private institutions across the United States that are beneficiaries of indigenous land.
And maybe just to add to that, you mentioned all the white space on the map that's not Morrill Act land. You can do, I think what Bobby has done in terms of putting these like two data sources together, you can do with almost anything in the United States. So if you want to make a map with that base layer and then put on all of your national parks, you're doing the exact same thing. Or you want to look at, the Homestead Act, for instance, and gather all those parcels. You can do that. So all the white space that you're describing are actually other stories of indigenous dispossession and wealth transfer that are just going through different acts in different areas. So, this is just one data set that's attached to that base layer of land cessions. You can attach anything to it and still come away with the same more or less come away with the same takeaways that this is a wealth transfer for other things outside of the Morrill Act.
Yeah, so I will just mention for other people who have likely not seen it that Bobby does have a wonderful article in the Journal of American History that sort of does a very similar treatment with the Louisiana Purchase and identifying where the indigenous owners of that land. So I assume your forthcoming book is doing the same thing. I just wonder, if people are only exposed to this a little bit, they might lose sight of this other issue. And I just wonder how you, obviously you're aware of it, but it came up in one of my students in my class, for instance, who had heard of this. But the obvious answer I thought was, well, it's all indigenous land. It isn't just the land grant land that people might miss that. But
if I may, I answer to that in the ways that we tackle that question with the website. Nancy, it's just like, so what we did was specifically that, like Land Grab EU is giving us all this set of information, and we wanted to localize it, but also connect it with the national trend. So what we did in the case of Connecticut is acknowledging that there are two ways that Connecticut engaged with the displacement of Native communities. One was the establishment of the state, is indigenous lands, and we trace that on the Connecticut timeline, specifically saying from the Connecticut Charter, the ordinances, tracing the story of how the Native communities that were in this territory were displaced. And then the second part in which Connecticut and Yukon specifically engage with this story is through the land grab, the Morrill Act. So I would say that definitely there is then the best line that Land Grab EU posts in the article, but I think like there is also an opportunity for the universities that are engaging for this difficult story, not to focus only on the Morrill Act, but focus on the land in which we are standing, that there are different ways in which the states and the universities are colonizing, right? So we made that quite clear on the website, and maybe you could send your students to that Connecticut timeline. The introduction is very specific in saying there are two ways, not only one, probably more.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Louisa.
Louisa, did you have a question too you wanted to ask?
No, I was just
Okay.
going to interject that. I'll put my hand down.
Just making sure. Kiara, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kiara Rosa. I am the program specialist at UConn Puerto Rican Latino American Cultural Center, and I've worked with SAGE and some NECPU folks in the past. But I'm so thankful for this space. I wanted to ask a question about action items that we can bring into the space. As educators, we have a responsibility to support all of our students, and specifically our Indigenous students in this conversation. And I know these conversations are very difficult to have with administrators or people in powerful positions within the university. So I wanted to hear a little bit about your conversations that you may have had with administrators, what challenges you have faced, and maybe how we can all start making progress in action items to actually bring this awareness to not only students, but also administrators. So that's my question.
We have had no conversations with administrators. In fact, if you take a look at on the sites, you'll see when folks actually wrote back to us in response to our queries. Obviously, we'll give a little bit of benefit of the doubt because that's when COVID was making its way and a lot of press officers couldn't deal with getting back to us. But we have made space for folks to respond, and we update those, and nobody's asked to do that so far. So really, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Bobby, Ohio is the only one where administrators have actually sort of been supportive of the actions that are happening there. Usually it's just faculty, staff, and students that are organizing and pushing and hoping that administration talks to them. So yeah, we have not.
My understanding is that there has been some support from the administration at Ohio, at Cornell. It's been much less so. This is a sort of a departmental level or program level. The American Indian Studies program there is spearheading these efforts. Our contact points, I mean, in addition to trying to get comments when we were first publishing the story, which, you know, some came in towards the end. But there weren't a whole lot. There wasn't a robust reaction at the time. But we have spoken. We've done quite a few events at universities, and I think when we were at the University of Missouri, there were administrators in the audience, and at a couple of other universities, there were administrators who had come to see what it was about. I think there were people from the the AAUP. Or the Association of Public and Land Grant Colleges was at an event at Ohio, but they have been rather limited, as Tristan mentioned.
So that's probably not a satisfying answer to your question, but that's what we got.
No, thank you.
Perhaps we'll take one more question. If anyone has one, feel free to unmute. All right. Well, I guess with that, we will. Oh, Louisa, did you have something?
Yeah, I just want, because this week we made I realized I didn't know that Indigenous studies is becoming mandatory in the student curriculum here at UConn, here in Connecticut. So there is a big discussion on how to prepare the body of teachers, many of them who do not have a formation in social sciences, to tackle this issue. Also because you want to incorporate it to American history, because it's definitely part of that. That which all these projects do, but then at the level of the knowledge of each community, it gets a little bit trickier. So I was wondering if you have not only participated with people like localizing this research, but also people at this 12K school, 12th high school, middle school level, trying to get at this information that you have used and put it out there in the schools, and how that process has been.
I mean, Bobby, unless you have, a short answer, I think, is no. But we do know that the Pulitzer Center has been working on putting together a curriculum that would be for, I think, university as well as potentially like high school. I'm not sure on the status of, I just asked about it again like a couple of weeks ago. So I'm not sure on the status on where that is, but they are developing a curriculum. It's the same team that put together the 1619 projects curriculum. So they're doing the same with this story. So we'll keep you posted, but
I think they're working with a team out of the University of Arizona. Is out of the education department there, is working on translating some of this material for different levels.
And I do believe there's a special reprint coming from High Country News that's going to be for universities. Also kind of unclear on what's going on there either, so I'll probably get back to you on that. But I think they'll have like a collection of the reporting as well as other folks' work around this. And I think they're hoping to pull in curriculum stuff on it too. But as you all know, this project kind of has taken on a life of its own outside of what we did around it, which is really cool. But sometimes we're in the dark on
Yeah.
that are going on.
I would just only say, I know you have a lot of work, but for example, for a gallery on the Smithsonian, we put together the gallery, very historically curated, and then we make a package for students in primary school that is very accessible for them to understand what we're talking about. So if you want to apply for any other grants or anything like that, I think it would be a good idea just to, and it's something that we're also thinking about, how we design like a small package that is designed for low common people to understand this very difficult story in a more accessible way. So just throwing it on there.
That reminds me of a conversation we had a very long time ago. Nothing has come of it, but I still would like to see something come of it because Caitlin took quite a large number of photos. I would love to see an exhibit at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington of his photos, all the ones that we couldn't publish, put up, blown up large, so you can see all of these snapshots of sort of everyday America with this sort of hidden history behind it.
Yeah, so let us know. Always happy to.
Of course, I will. I am still trying. They are very hard to reach, but I have some people there, and hopefully we're just trying to get them to post us on the Instagram and Twitter, and then we'll see from there.
So I guess on that note, we will call to close. I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to this keynote address. It was wonderful. Always a pleasure to listen to this work and to be able to draw inspiration from it in our own areas of work and research. So it was really awesome that you guys were willing to join us, and we are so thankful for everything you've done and for letting Land Grab CT come to light. So thank you everyone for joining, and happy Indigenous Peoples Week.
Thanks
Thank you
everyone.
for having us.